Hey everyone, this is a direct follow-up to yesterday's video, because I got two comments that got me thinking about this a lot more. The first one was one from Chara that said that Heavy would probably be fine if it didn't get a buff and instead just got a better kit, and now this would cause problems for it down the line. And that got me thinking on if that's true or not, because I initially said I agree, and I still probably do, but I can't say for sure. If Heavy woke up one day with like Splash Wall Booyah Bomb or something, maybe it would be good enough to start winning, but I can't say that with complete certainty by any means. That did get me thinking though, and what spurred that thinking on even more is the idea of another comment I got from a few different people saying that long-range chargers are consistently overtuned and that this is what they have to do for Splatlings to keep up with them. So let me question that statement right away. Are long-range chargers overtuned? Well, first we can look at Splat Charger. This is a weapon that has 3 insane kits, all of them being much cheaper points for special than they ever were in Splatoon 2, where these were like 220 and 210 respectively. Like, it seems like there'd be every reason to use these if they were overtuned, but Splat Chargers can't seem to catch a break. Outside of occasionally seeing this one in Rainmaker, the results of this weapon are basically in the gutter. Even with a leader getting wins in zones sometimes, the amount of times that leader will swap to a short-range charger is basically zero. It's been almost entirely phased out at this point. So I think any arguments that this set of weapons is overtuned is pretty out the window. Leader is the next one a lot of people complain about, and while I can see this one a little more given it actually has some wins, Leader's tournament results aren't necessarily anything insane. They're almost exclusively done by only like 2 or 3 players in the scene, and that's an incredibly low amount. If you compare that with other weapons that are getting results to this level, it doesn't seem like it's anything extraordinary here. Maybe if it had a bit more of an unhealthy kit, it could be spiking things a bit. But at its current set of 210p Wavebreaker as its highest kit, it's kind of hard to say that this would necessarily be overpowered by any means. Overtuned, maybe you could make the argument for it. The long-range one-shots are a little crazy, but the most recent patch did address this by making Swim Form much better at dodging them. Now that does affect Splatlings a lot less, and we'll get into that, but given that Leader before was already barely winning, and it was inevitably made a harder weapon, while it is still one of the better weapons in the game, I think it'd be hard-pressed to call this overtuned by any means. Pencil's probably the one you'd have the easiest time making this argument for. I mean, it's been at the top of the game for forever, and it definitely had overtuned stats before. But as of right now, it's facing more competition from other anchors than ever before. Rapid, Bow, and E-Leader have all gotten wins on it. And recently, even Heavy has gotten a win, albeit alongside Pencil. And Heavy, I guess, is after the buff, if you want to count that. I'm not necessarily opposed to this weapon being toned back further, as compared with E-Leader when we get to the hitbox changes. This one's a little bit more lenient, given it already started with a slightly larger hitbox size. But even then, I think that's a pretty tiny numbers tweak to adjust this back to normal, and I don't think it particularly affects its matchup against things like Splatlings very much. So, you can kind of see where I'm getting at with this. I don't think that chargers are necessarily the entire reason Splatlings aren't being used anymore. I think Splatlings just are a very kit-dependent weapon. They paint and get a lot of specials, whether we're talking about before or after the patch. And so it seemed like having a good kit would be a prerequisite to it being good. And let's take a look at what they did now with a little bit of a different lens. I want to approach Heavy's buff with the idea of why they did it. Because as much as the buff is a little bit annoying, I think it's also worth noting, I really need to turn off my alarm before I record these. I think it's also worth noting that this has been a game where the devs have been particularly careful about doing paint changes and adjusting paint nerfs. The two most recent big paint buffs besides this are Brella, which got an immediate plus 20 points for special, you know, the most ever seen in the series on its Sorella kit, and got a compensation nerf where the pellet spread makes it harder to hit people, and Dynamo Roller, which proceeded to get more ink hungry than it did in Splatoon 1. So why did Heavies happen without any compensation? Well, here's my thought process. If Heavy Splatling struggles against Chargers or even other anchors by the fact that it just doesn't win those matchups, giving it the ability to force others to have to take it down and play more aggressively into it is one way around that problem. I'm not saying this is a good way, I just want you to roll with me that this was their line of thought for a bit. The idea that Heavy had to be able to outpaint or out-passive value other backlines like chargers or bows or Explo. And so doing this forces heavy splatling into a role, or forces the other weapons into a role where they have to deal with heavy and take fights more on its own terms. The other thing it does is what we saw in Area Cup. The ability to paint this much gives it much more flexibility for comps. Running it alongside another backline that can take care of those matchups and allow Splatling to focus the more short and mid-range matchups it thrives in is another use case for it. Or you could go the route that we've seen a bit experimented with in the West here, which is running heavy as the only painting weapon, running it alongside a cooler support like Chara and 2 fighting weapons to allow you to have a little bit more, capable fighting power. That's all well and good at all, and I think this actually is a pretty valid idea that kind of works. Passive painting is not something I'm particularly a fan of, but in this case, when it's done with a special at this power level, I do see the potential to force fights without it being too oppressive. Wavebreaker is mostly helpful for scouting, retake, and really fighting-based comps that are going to combo off the damage. It doesn't really synchronize best with passive styles of play. You'll see it occasionally in solo when a bunch of painting weapons line up, but in competitive play I don't think it's anything to write home about. So is heavy still a problem even if it's not spamming anything particularly useful? Well, yes, I think it is still a problem, admittedly. So I like this idea on paper, and I've been talking about it on paper, because I do think the comps that it opens up for the weapon are really interesting, and it can be compensated by weapons that cover the fighting power, and it can, force its matchups into a way that are a little bit more dynamic. Here's the problem. I don't think a weapon that paints really well on its own is necessarily bad. I think a weapon that paints really easily without much contention is really bad. My issue with heavy is that its painting power is ridiculously easy. Your mobility is insane. Your range is insane. Your paint total is insane. You get 4.5 charges without any ink saver investment whatsoever, and your points for special are so cheap that you can use Wavebreaker to refill your ink tank. And you have a sprinkler that paints the floor with you, which is a great option for backline weapons. Short range weapons that have to paint around typically have to deal with the fact that they don't have a lot of range. So they're fast and they paint well, but they can't contest very far away without putting themselves in the combat range of other weapons. If we go to more mid-range weapons, they tend to be a little bit more ink hungry, but also slower. Something like a 96 is a lot harder of a time avoiding shots. Weapons like Dynamo Roller, now that they actually paint, have the compensation of both being slow, but also having downtime. It has like a second of whiting frames, and you only have 4 shots if you're running no main saver. Even main saver is only going to get you to 7 if you're sacrificing most of your build. What does heavy splatling have that makes painting difficult? Practically nothing. Even Jet Squelcher has its main kit in this game with a burst bomb, something that will regularly conflict with your uptime if you're going to be using it to fight frequently, and is special to get up close. Heavy does not have anything that makes painting difficult, and that's my problem with the weapon. I like the idea of what this weapon can provide in terms of a comp, in terms of its flexibility and all that, but it doesn't come with any added skill ceiling. If anything, it's been so easy that we've been seeing a bunch of people spamming heavy and doing nothing but painting the zone. And that's not fun for anyone, obviously. So, what I would like to propose, because obviously this patch is coming up, is actually to keep most of the paint of this weapon intact. Tone it down a little bit, like 5 to 7%. I think it should be a little less. But primarily what I'd like to see is Wavebreaker should be more expensive at 210, and the weapon should be more ink hungry. I think getting only a little bit over 3 full charges on an ink tank. Heavy's uptime requires that it cycles Wavebreaker in order for it to retain this ridiculous amount of paint output. By having a higher ink cost and a higher output special, you not only tone back special spam, but you give the weapon much needed downtime for those closer range than it to get closer. We've already seen with Rapid that feels a lot better for its worst matchups, but more importantly, it adds much more to the skill of painting. If you want to stack a bunch of main saver to get around this nerf, your mobility is going to be reduced and you're going to be an easier target. And if you don't run main saver, you need to paint quite a good bit in order to get wave to cycle it. Now, the numbers on this and how exactly you do it could be tweaked a little bit, but generally what I'm saying is I think ink efficiency should be the main nerf, and that points for special and paint should be smaller nerfs, rather than what will probably happen, which is the paint and points for special getting the main tone down. I want it to be harder to cycle Wavebreaker, not impossible. I want it harder to retain uptime, not impossible. I want it to be something where the weapon actually has to try for these kind of things. And the upside is you get to keep all the positives this change provides. Running heavy as a weird midline with something like pencil is still possible, or running it as the main painting weapon to comp is still possible. It's just harder now. Final thought though. Would this change work on other Splylings? If this was a test run for balancing the other ones, what do we think about that? Mini honestly has the insane paint and uptime qualities Heavy already does, it's just balanced out by the range we talked about earlier. Hydra's could honestly work, but it would be a little bit scary. Hydra getting a lot more of its specials could be genuinely really threatening, and a large charge time and lower mobility already have reasonable cooldowns. But this weapon can also be a problem at lower ranks, so I don't know if we'd see it for that reason alone. Edit Splyling, if you think about it, kind of already has this same treatment Heavy and Mini admittedly have. In this case, it's balanced out by its extremely large charge time, meaning if you want to be firing really fast, you have to charge for the second longest charge time in the entire Splyling class. A mechanic that's clearly balanced it out pretty well, if anything maybe a little too well, we haven't seen it for a while. And then lastly would be Ballpoint and Nautilus, where I think this change wouldn't work. Nautilus already paints really well for the type of fighting weapon it is, and Ballpoint is much more about flexibility between two fighting modes, and its long-range mode is much more about actual damage than it is about paint. So I don't think either of these weapons could be balanced in that way. Now, let me make it totally clear at the end of this video, okay? I totally think that this design direction with Heavy is potentially flawed, and if you add a powerful kit to the weapon, it would now basically have to be a 220 points for special weapon in order to compensate for it. But I do think the idea does have a little bit of merits if it were balanced around properly. I could see a version of Heavy that is a paint monster being a lot more interesting when it comes to comp building and its unique synergies. But if they're gonna do that, it needs to be in a way where Heavy just isn't a total free paint bot. You gotta make painting difficult on it too. But that's just my thoughts. Let me know what you all think, and I'll see you guys next time.